When we get to Article 1, now we're talking about the legislative branch, lawmaking, and it is the longest of the articles in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 1 deals with congressional power in establishing a bicameral legislature. And basically it says that the legislative or lawmaking branch of the U.S. is called Congress, and it is to be comprised of two houses, a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 2 is going to outline the election and selection of representatives. Elections for the House is every 2 years. Voting for representatives is determined by each state. However, those who have the right to vote in an election for the largest branch of their government must be allowed to vote. You can't exclude anybody who's eligible. A representative must be at least 25 years old to run, must have been a U.S. citizen for 7 years, and must, at the time of the election, be a citizen of the state that they intend to represent, and in the district they're going to represent. The number of representatives in the House of Representatives is determined by a population count, and actually the allocation of them is. If there are 435 representatives, and that's been the case since the 1920s, and there are 435, roughly it comes out to one to about every 650,000 people. So the more population a state has, the more representatives it will get. Every 10 years we do the census. Also, there was a clause in there that said that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person, and Native Americans who are not taxed can't be counted, and that the state would send one representative per 30,000. It's now about 1 to about 650,000. Every state gets at least one representative, regardless of its population, even if its population didn't reach 30,000. Until the first population count, the number of representatives for the 13 states was set at 3 for New Hampshire, 8 for Massachusetts, 1 for Rhode Island, because it didn't even have the 30,000, 5 for Connecticut, 6 for New York, 4 for New Jersey, 8 for Pennsylvania, 1 for Delaware, 6 for Maryland, 10 for Virginia, 5 for North Carolina, South Carolina 5, and Georgia 3. So you can tell that Virginia was definitely the most populous state, then after that Pennsylvania, and then after that New York. And Massachusetts, excuse me. If a representative spot was suddenly vacated, the executive power from the state determines how that position would be filled. They have to have an election. The House chooses its own speaker and other officers. The power of impeachment resides in the House, which means the House can accuse an executive of a high crime or misdemeanor, but the Senate has to convict. The Senate, each state sends 2 senators as representatives to the Senate. The legislative branch of each of the states selects the senators. That's the way it used to work. This changed in 1913. Senators would serve a 6-year period. The first time the senators showed up, though, they were broken into 3 groups, and then they would have to run. The first group ran after 2 years, the second group ran after 4 years, and the third group ran after 6 years. Each senator has 1 vote. Note that since the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913, the senators have been directly elected by the people rather than appointed by their state legislatures. Now we directly vote for our senators. They divided senators into 3 groups so that not all the senators would be up for re-election at the same time. And they established a rotation system so that only a third of the Senate would be replaced every 2 years. If a senator's spot is suddenly vacated, the executive power from the state has to appoint a temporary replacement until they can meet again as a state legislature and choose a permanent replacement. And this means that the Senate is a continuous body. A continuous body means that it, unlike the House of Representatives, is always in session. They never stop. A continuous body. A senator has to be at least 30 years old. They have to have been a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years. They have to, at the time of the election, be a citizen from the state that they're being elected from. The vice president serves as president of the Senate but will not be allowed to vote except to break a tie. The Senate would choose its other officers when the vice president is temporarily absent or is exercising the powers of the president of the United States. The Senate can choose a temporary replacement called the president pro tem. Most of the time, even now, the president pro tem presides. The senator, the vice president doesn't usually show up unless it's to break a tie. The Senate will try all cases of impeachment. The Chief Justice presides over presidential impeachment trials. The conviction requires that 2/3 of the members of the Senate that are present have to agree. The Senate can only remove a convicted official from office and disqualify him from holding another federal office. They cannot punish them criminally. If they're going to be criminally or civilly punished, that has to go through the courts. In Article 1, Section 4, we look at the rules of electing members of Congress and for when Congress will meet. The manner of election in each state is solely determined by that state. Congress can alter the means of elections and they can regulate who's eligible for an election. Things like civil rights law have applied. Congress meets once a year, beginning on the first Monday in December, unless a new law changes on that day. And the 20th Amendment, ratified in 1933, changed the day Congress convenes to January 3rd, not in December now. Each House will determine its own rules and regulations for membership and proceedings. A majority of its members present will make a quorum. When there's not a quorum available, then they can have a quorum call, and the House or the Senate have to be in recess until that quorum call is met. A member cannot be expelled from either house without a 2/3 vote from that house to agree to his expulsion. That's called censure. Each house will keep its own records of its meetings, and it publishes those records. And we have the Congressional Journal, the Congressional Daily, that basically publish all of the congressional records. Neither of the houses can adjourn for more than 3 days without the approval of the other house. Neither house can adjourn to a location that is different from where that house is presently meeting. That's so they don't run away from each other. In Article 1, Section 6, it talks about salaries, privileges, and constraints. Senators and representatives have to be paid from the U.S. Treasury. Their salaries are determined by law. The 27th Amendment deals with Congress, the House, giving itself a raise in the same 2-year session. If they're going to give themselves a raise, they can't get the money until they stand for re-election. Senators and representatives cannot be arrested for a crime except for treason, felony, or a breach of the peace while meeting in Congress or while traveling to or from a meeting in Congress. Freedom of speech is protected in both houses. And while a senator or representative is serving in Congress, they can't take a civilian job newly created by the government or any civilian job that has recently had its salary raised. And no one holding another post in the government can serve at the same time as a senator or a representative. That's so that we can separate the branches. In Article 1, Section 7, it discusses how a bill is going to become law. And I know we're going through these rather quickly because we're going to take a lot more time as we go through this course looking at each of these sections in the Constitution. Don't worry. A proposed law or a bill can originate in the House or the Senate, except for a tax law. Any law that's going to deal with taxes has to originate in the House, and that's because of this complaint, no taxation without representation. Remember that from 1776? If a bill is passed in the House and the Senate, it can go to the president for review and signature. The president has the right to accept that bill or to return it with an objection, called a veto, that has originally proposed to the House that originally proposed it. Once that bill is returned, the objection to the House must be recorded into the journal. If 2/3 of the House agrees to pass the bill, then it's sent to the other House for reconsideration. If 2/3 of that House agrees, this is called an override. Okay, if 2/3 of the other House also agrees, then it automatically becomes law despite the president's veto. That's the override. In both houses, the veto is recorded in the journal. If the president takes more than 10 days to return a bill, not counting a Sunday, then the bill automatically becomes law. Congress, unless Congress has ended its session. If it's ended its session during that within the 10-day period, then the bill dies, and this is known as a pocket veto. Anytime the Senate or the House of Representatives vote together on an order, a resolution, or another issue besides a bill, except for a joint resolution to adjourn, that vote has to be presented to and approved by the president before it can become effective. Now, if the president rejects the vote of Congress, then the vote is effective if 2/3 of the House is override. It's similar to the procedure that we had for passing a bill. This is a joint resolution. All right, so now we're going to get into the big long one, which is your enumerated powers that are given to Congress. So I've got this in 2 slides. Congress has the power to levy and to collect taxes, and that includes taxes on imports, to pay debts, to defend the nation, and to protect general welfare. All taxes on trade have to be uniform throughout the nation. And this is a really important one because this was part of the commerce compromise that we talked about in the last lesson. Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations, between nations, and between the states, and with Native American tribes. Congress can borrow money on credit. It can determine rules of citizenship and naturalization, and it can establish laws of bankruptcy that apply to the entire nation. Congress has the power to coin money and establish its value, and it has the power to prosecute anybody who counterfeits money. It can set standards of weights and measures and determine punishing for counterfeits. It can establish a postal road and a post office. It can determine a system of copyright and patent, and it can protect those patents and copyrights. It can determine the federal court system below the Supreme Court, what we call the inferior courts. It has the authority to judge whether or not a crime has been committed at sea and to decide on an appropriate punishment, and it can determine how to punish a violation of international law. And by the way, you might think that piracy and crimes at sea are, well, that's old stuff. Just think about the Maersk, Alabama, just a few years ago, Captain Phillips, where we sent the Navy SEALs to shoot the Somali pirates, and we used this clause to justify it. Congress can declare war, issues letter of marque and reprisal, and grant private citizens the right to capture enemy ships in wartime and to make rules of capture in land and water. It can fund and maintain an army, but it may not give money for that purpose for more than a 2-year period, so it has to refund the military every 2 years. It also provides and maintains a navy, and it makes the rules that regulate both the Army and the Navy. It has the authority to call on local militia so that you can enforce the laws of the nation, to suppress any internal rebellion, to provide defense against an invasion. It has to. Congress provides for weapons, discipline, and organization for militias. The states appoint the officers and they train the militia under the rules of discipline established by Congress, and Congress can call up the militia or federalize them. A separate district then is set aside, the District of Columbia, as the capital of the United States, and the district is made up of land that comes from at least 3 states, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Congress exerts similar authority over pieces of land that are parts of other states that are federal territory, or government forts, arsenals, or government buildings. So Fort Bliss, for instance, is federal property. Congress has the authority to make any additional laws necessary to execute any of these powers. That's called the Elastic Clause. And it's called that because it can stretch as much as the government wants it to. And these are what we call implied powers. And oftentimes these implied powers can go really far, and then they end up in court, and the courts look at them, and the Supreme Court every now and then will say, no, you can't do that. But oftentimes they'll say, yes, you can. So what are the things Congress cannot do? The states are allowed to continue the slave trade until 1808, so Congress could not stop the slave trade for 20 years after passing the Constitution. The right to habeas corpus which basically means the right to be brought before a judge and told what your charges are cannot be suspended. No bills of attainder can be passed, which basically means you can't lose your civil rights and be condemned of a crime without going through a trial. You can't have your property confiscated without going through a trial. Congress was forbidden from levying a direct tax on the population. What it did was it would tax the states. It wasn't until 1913 that Congress directly started to tax the income of the people. And Congress cannot tax the exportation of items coming out of the states. They can only tax the importation of items. And Congress cannot give special treatment to any one state or its ports, and they're not allowed to charge a fee for ships from other states that enter into their ports. Congress can't spend any of its money without clearly indicating why they're going to spend it, and they have to publish a record of all their expenses. And the U.S. Cannot grant a title of nobility. No kings, no queens, no dukes, no earls. No person holding a government office can be allowed to accept any gifts or titles from a foreign country or a leader without permission of Congress. So that means that when the president gets a gift from another country, he has to give it over to the government, and then they keep it. In Article 1, Section 10, we're talking about those things the states can't do. The states cannot enter into any treaty or alliance or pass a letter of marque or reprisal which grants permission of citizens to plunder a ship during war. States can't coin money, can't print money, and can't accept anything but gold or silver as payment for debts. And of course, now we have currency. States can't allow criminal convictions without a trial or pass any ex post facto law. Ex post facto means a law that is passed that punishes something for being illegal, even though it was legal when you did it. Only with the explicit permission of Congress can any state impose a duty on trade, unless doing so is absolutely necessary for inspecting things going into that state. Any duties that are collected in excess of those for the purposes of inspection have to be given over to the Treasury. Any state law governing trade duties must be revised and controlled by Congress. States are allowed, they're prohibited from putting a duty on a ship tonnage or maintaining troops or navy in times of peace without the approval of Congress. States can't enter into agreements with other states or foreign powers or engage in war without the permission of Congress unless acting in defense of their state from invasion. So if we were being suddenly invaded through the Mexican border, we could defend ourselves, but define defense.